Hello and welcome to the Wallingford School Street Sidewalk Replacement Project first public meeting. In this meeting we'll cover public input on local concerns and then we'll actually jump into a presentation of some alternatives being considered for the project and get some input on that. Sorry. There we go. So jumping right in, we'll start with the next slide introducing the project team. From there we'll discuss a purpose and need to drive this project and review the scope and schedule that's been agreed upon to hopefully work through the project details and into construction. From there we'll talk about the existing conditions that we've reviewed to date along the corridor, and then discuss opportunities and constraints. That's really the public information input that we're looking to receive. And then we'll transition into an alternatives discussion, talk about some of the things that we've been considering about how to build out the sidewalk on School Street, and then any general feedback, comments, discussion, and then we'll close out with discussing where we're going next on the project. So my name is Brendan Roberts. I work for an engineering consulting firm called VHB. I am the project manager for this project. I have Rose O'Brien with me here tonight. She is also from VHB. She'll help answer questions and take notes as needed. The project engineer who's not with us tonight is Sierra Ford, but she's been involved to date. And then Stephanie Bork in the back is the municipal project manager from Rutland Regional, and then we have the other names on this are what form the steering committee, John Lemieux from V-Trans, and then the other from the town of Wallingford. So starting with the draft purpose and needs statement. So the purpose of this project, the Wallingford School Street Sidewalk Replacement Project, is to improve pedestrian accessibility, connectivity, and safety along School Street between the adjacent community and the Wallingford Village Center. So when we talk about what's driving this project, we like to identify at first the needs to have a project. So really we identified three driving forces behind this sidewalk replacement. In summary, the very first one being to better the connection and create an ADA compliant facility for all user groups from the village center to the community and the community resources like the school and town hall along School Street. The second one being to evaluate and consider those north-south connections, which are the two mid-block crossings, one at Prospect Street and one at Hillside. So the sidewalk goes east-west, so also making sure that we're considering the north-south movements because that's where other community members may live up in those neighborhoods. And then the third thing that was identified that we're looking to consider with this project is an evaluation of the existing parking facilities. We understand that when there's town events, there may be some crowded areas and really, technically, only the north side of the road can sustain parallel parking right now while maintaining vehicular throughway along the roadway without crowding it. So maybe there's a reason to look at expanding the south side and adding some parking there to promote people not parking in the throughways. So I want to pause right here. I know we discussed with some of you during the field visit immediately before this, but are there any comments, questions, or concerns about the purpose statement or the needs that we've identified, maybe something we haven't thought of or anything like that? Great. If there is, feel free to stop me. So moving on to scope and schedule. This is the typical delivery process for a project like this that's funded through V-Trans. So we started with a project kickoff back in June, and then we jumped right into base mapping and review of existing conditions. So that includes not just survey, but also review of the existing right-of-way, review from a natural resource perspective, review from a historical resource perspective, and review of an archaeologically resource perspective. From there, that formed an existing conditions discussion, and We worked with the steering committee and V-Trans to identify maybe some points along the corridor that were of concern, making sure that we didn't impact, and maybe some opportunities as well throughout the corridor that we weren't fully considered just from the paper view that we understood the project to be. From there, we're having this meeting now, so this is to discuss any local concerns about the existing conditions and where the project is heading, and also discuss some alternatives that we've considered collectively to date. Following this, we'll look to identify the preferred alternative for the corridor and move it into conceptual plan development. We'll utilize those conceptual plans to do the permitting and right-of-way process if needed. The good thing, and we'll talk about that, is we can most likely do this project without many impacts to really any of it. So we'll talk about that and where the alternatives leave us there. From there, once right-of-way and permitting is cleared, we will look to produce final plans. This is when we develop the construction specifications. We really hone in on the project budget to construct and work through our final revisions and pretty much tidy up the plan set to bring it into construction. So putting a date to all of that, we're looking to, so I'll highlight a couple things. So when we get our conceptual plans March of next year, we enter that right-of-way and permitting phase. Knowing that permitting will most likely not be too impactful with this project, right-of-way is really the big question mark. So if we can really work with alternatives that stay within the right-of-way, there's an opportunity to slim this schedule down by 6 months to a year. So we have some fluff there in that right-of-way category. That's why you see a jump from April 2024 to February 2025. So if we can cut that down, then everything really shifts significantly. But ultimately, if we can't cut it down and we do have right-of-way implications, we're looking at construction in 2026. So, looking at the project corridor that's up for consideration and development with this project, we're identifying approximately 650 feet on the north side of School Street and 2,000 feet on the south side of School Street. That being said, the project starts all the way to the east, all the way to the west at the intersection with Main Street, just back off about 50 feet, and you'll see a joint in the existing sidewalk where the sidewalk on Main Street or US 7 is concrete, but then the sidewalk on School Street is asphalt. That's the starting point for this project. It's almost identical on the north side and south side. There's a slight deviation, but more or less that's the starting point. And then as you proceed to Prospect Street, this existing sidewalk ends, and there's a crosswalk there, but then on the north side, on the south side, the existing sidewalk continues all the way through this last dwelling that you see in the bottom right corner of the screen. This corridor also includes the Wallingford Elementary School, as well as those two mid-block crossings that I was discussing, one just west of Prospect Street and one just west of Hillside Road. And then when we really started identifying the needs of this project and looking at the corridor as a whole, we saw a differentiation between what the utility may be for the west side of the project versus the east side of the project. So as I move forward in this discussion tonight, I'm going to draw a line at Prospect Street, and we're going to have two separate discussions and alternatives that we present, but mostly steer it around everything that's west of Prospect Street and everything that's east of Prospect Street. So we can tie it all together in the end, but it's easier to look at them because they have separate utility as a division line at Prospect. Any questions about this? Great. So first thing I just want to talk about is some representative photos and conditions that we found throughout the corridor. So again, steering the conversation first about the western half of this project. The upper left, you can see that there are sections where the sidewalk is directly adjacent to the roadway. So here we're considering that the curb is really the division between the roadway corridor and the sidewalk corridor. But then there's also these unique features at certain points throughout the corridor, like that ADA ramp for the Baptist church that we'll have to consider with the build out of the sidewalk. In the upper corner, you can see Taft Road, or Taft Terrace, sorry, and you can see, again, parallel parking on that north side of the road as what's depicted in the upper left corner, where on the bottom right corner, you can tell that that shoulder is much narrower and not really supportive of a parallel parking opportunity that's fully off the travelway of the roadway. As we look to the bottom left, you can see that the sidewalk deviates from being adjacent to the curb, and we'll talk about how that differentiates and what we're considering for an alternative and what kind of opportunities that give us to avoid maybe some of those other obstacles by shifting the sidewalk one way or the other when we try to widen. But ultimately, we're looking to achieve a 5-foot wide sidewalk throughout the entirety of the project. Anyone that wants to bring something up about something that's west of Prospect Street? I have a map here with house numbers, just in case it's your house and you want to talk about a very specific location. Otherwise, it's just an overview of pretty much Prospect and a little bit beyond. And I'd be happy to talk about any of it.
Are you thinking about making more wider parking spaces west of the town hall, like up further?
Yep, so like I had mentioned, we looked at a few alternatives, and when we get into the alternatives discussion, 2 out of the 3 alternatives we'll be talking about will promote an opportunity for parking on both sides of the road.
Okay.
Anything else about the western half of this project? All right, well, there'll be plenty of opportunity as we continue, but moving on to the eastern side, I just want to point out a couple of representative photos of what we see once we get past Prospect Street. The biggest thing to note is the sidewalk shifts over to only being on the south side of the road, but it also narrows out the further you get away from Route 7. So where we start right around Route 7 at that 5-foot wide sidewalk, we then eventually make our way down to about a 3-foot wide sidewalk. So that's where our biggest impacts are most likely to occur for constructing the sidewalk itself. Maybe not impacts to adjacent properties because you do get more of a grass belt down there, but wider impacts for construction limits. Once we get near the very end of the project, as you can see in the upper right-hand corner, the sidewalk then shifts back to being directly adjacent to the road. Maybe it's less restrictive because the dwellings are offset a little further than they are at the very western side of the project, where there's a couple foundation walls, that ADA ramp that I pointed out right up against it, but still directly against the road, and that comes into further discussion when we talk about what to do with the curb line. And then the represented photo on the bottom left corner shows that there's no sidewalk on the north side of the road, as I had mentioned there. Any thoughts about the eastern side of the existing conditions of this project? Any concerns? Great.
It seems like you answered a lot of our questions on the walk.
That was the goal. That way I can eat dinner before 10 p.m. So, again, happy to discuss concerns going forward, but I'm going to now steer the conversation into the alternatives that we discussed. You see the word selection up here, and we'll talk about that further in the next steps. But ultimately, we're looking to base this next conversation around the alternatives we're considering and try to identify maybe what people's preferred alternative would be. And that could be a combination of something different on the west versus different on the east, due to budgetary or other impacts that we're considering. So we'll talk about the timeline for selection after this, but ultimately this is gearing up to then select the preferred alternative. So, starting with alternative 1, again, I'm going to base this conversation around the western side versus the eastern side. And I understand that there's a lot of information on this screen, so I will highlight what the concept is, and we can use our imagination of what that will look like throughout and drive the conversation from there. So, alternative 1 works around retaining the existing curb line and reconstructing the sidewalk on the outside of the curb towards the dwellings. So I say towards the dwellings, I don't mean impacting the dwellings, I just mean we're not touching the roadway or the curb line interface. Now that can vary. We did note a few places on our walk earlier than this where the existing curb maybe was a little too out of whack, a little too deficient, and needed to be replaced or even missing. We noticed a few places near some drainage structures that the curb line was missing entirely. So we would note those in the construction plans. Most likely, we would talk with the town about that, but we would most likely note those particular sections to be removed and reset or replaced. But ultimately, the typical section for this alternative is to retain the curb, and we'll talk about how that benefits the cost of the project and all that, but through Prospect Street. Moving on to alternative 2, we now talk about a shift in the curb line. So like I had mentioned, that third need that we're trying to see if we can fix with this project, creating parallel parking on the south side of the road. So existing condition right now is approximately an 8-foot parking lane on the north side of the road from Route 7 to Prospect Street, and then somewhere around a 5 to 6 foot shoulder on the south side of the road is the typical section for that length of the project. Current VTrans standards do not allow parallel parking in anything less than 7 feet. Even 7 feet is a little tight. Ideally, it's 8 feet, but for this type of roadway with this speed limit, it's usually permittable down to 7 feet. So this would be looking to meet that minimum 7-foot parking aisle or shoulder on the south side of the road by shifting the southern curb line 2 feet. By shifting that southern curb line 2 feet over, as was kind of depicted there, 2 feet max. It's not 2 feet everywhere. And if you look at the upper graphic, there's a thin level of blue that kind of goes in and out. That's how much the curb would have to shift throughout. Sorry, it's a little small on the screen. But ideally creating that 7-foot parking lane on the south side of the road while maintaining an 8-foot parking lane on the north side of the road. A pinch point, or a couple pinch points arise with this alternative to note. So again, right on that western edge there at the very end of the project, you can see that I highlight right here a pinch point. There's an existing staircase where an ADA ramp used to be coming out of that business. The sidewalk would go down to about 4'3" for the width of that staircase, so probably 5 feet or so. And then again at the very end of that dwelling right here, it goes down to about 4'6". So I know that the first need that's identified is creating an ADA compliant corridor for these sidewalks, and I will state that ADA compliance is around 200 feet for a 4-foot width as allowable, as long as you have at least 5-foot width beyond that 200-foot length for a ADA person to be able to pull over, let people pass, catch your breath if you're exhausted. So this would still meet ADA compliance because it's a very small section that we're deviating from the 5-foot width. Some of the other things to consider is that foundation on the very first dwelling on the south side and then the second dwelling on the south side or building. We're constructing almost right up against it to maintain this 5-foot sidewalk. So there would be careful consideration on how that works with the existing foundation, from construction means and methods to make sure that we're not damaging the foundation, drainage to make sure that we're conveying water flow away from the foundation, and just the overall tie-in to that. So we think that we could probably maintain about a 6-inch vegetated like soil or gravel buffer. Still, right now there's somewhere between 1 to 2 feet there from the existing sidewalk. So I don't think that we're going to construct right up against that for the second dwelling, but the very first one, the existing paved structure goes right to the building face, so we would be looking to essentially replace that with concrete. A couple other things to note about this is there are utility poles in that area and a couple manholes and drainage structures that are within the roadway right along the curb line or in the sidewalk infrastructure itself that we would be looking to adjust and look to make sure that water still flows to those structures. And if we can't figure that out easily, then we would be moving the structure to the new curb line. So that comes with a slightly added cost, but the goal would obviously be to not flood out the parking areas that we create, or leave anyone with a big old manhole in front of their house on the sidewalk that you have to kind of bump over in the sidewalk. So I'll just talk about alternative 3 quickly, and then we can have a greater conversation about all 3. So the third alternative looks at how to maintain an 8-foot parking aisle on the south side of the road while also reducing those pinch points that we just discussed at the very western end of the project. So by doing this, we talk about a shift in the roadway. So essentially moving those 2-foot curb line shifts that we were talking about on the south side to a 2 to 3 foot curb line shift on the north side now. So this gets you that extra foot on the south side, so you have 2 8-foot aisles on either side of the roadway, but this comes at repaving the roadway. So essentially we would look to mill the roadway about 2 inches and then add a 1/2 inch shim to the roadway with a pavement surface course that would more or less shift the crown of the roadway to the new center line, and then put an 1.5 inches of a top coat back over. That again, this is all conceptual, but that's more or less what it would cost, and that's what more or less what it would take, and that's what we had costed out when we talk about the price of these alternatives. So the big difference there, the cost in the roadway. The additional thing to note is that cost in that roadway is not something that is described in the current grant that the town has for this project. Now we're talking about a roadway project, not a pedestrian access project. So the additional monies for the roadway repaving would likely have to come at the expense to the town or an additional grant opportunity that may arise. The other thing to note is this takes a lot more coordination. This is Vermont 140. So this is a V-Trans property, not a town property. So when we talk about roadway reconstruction, they have a much larger say in the game. Well, they have a say in all of it, but this comes at a much larger coordination effort to get approval. So with that, these are the 3 typical sections next to each other. So again, that first one on the very top showing the existing curb lines being maintained. The one in the middle showing a remove and reset or new curb on both sides of the road, but also shifting that southern curb line up to 2 feet. And then the bottom one showing a repaving of the road and a center line shift of 2 feet or so to the north to maintain an 8-foot panel on either side of the travelways. I'm going to pause here. I'm also going to restate quickly that we're talking about US 7 to Prospect Street only right now. And open it up. I can go to any of those 4 slides I just shared and we can chat about any of the alternatives. I will state that the very next slide is a comparison matrix which gives prices and stuff, but I would like to hear your opinion before we talk about money. If there is one.
Is that what you said?
Comments, concerns, opportunities, desires. It could be anything, if there is anything. If not, we can talk about money.
It seems to me as though there's very little to be gained for the third alternative compared to the apparent cost.
I think that a lot of people share that mutual feeling. Yes.
To me, the most attractive option looks like alternative 2 for the western section, to increase the parking, which addresses the congestion problem, which happens on a regular basis there, while also getting the best value for the money that we're spending.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Yes, Stephanie?
Brandon, would there be an option with alternative two on the north side of the road to maybe not remove and reset and handle that curve?
Couldn't agree more, and I thought of that as I was doing the presentation, and I was like, oh yeah, we can talk about that after. Yes, I think that the reason, that's a perfect point on why we're splitting the corridor up with the western and eastern section, is to provide different alternatives for different sections of the roadway to figure out where the town can save money and where they desire to spend the money. So I think that that's even a further breakdown that could be considered between the north side of the road and the south side of the road with alternative 2, where you don't get that with alternative 3. All right. Well, cat's out of the bag, here's the cost. So the top row on this alternatives matrix is just a construction cost for the western section only. So we're looking with alternative 1, where we retain the existing curb line, approximately $300,000 to replace just the sidewalk while maintaining the curb line. And that's not just sidewalk, that also comes to adjustment to driveways, adjustment to landscaping, and all the other incidental things that we may end up touching along the way in construction. And it's also good to note, as we found during the discussion earlier, that to replace the sidewalk, we're excavating most likely about 18 inches because we don't know what's under the existing pavement that goes like a wave down the road. So we're looking to replace the subbase, make it structurally suitable, and then put the concrete on top. So that's where a lot of that money comes into play. Alternative 2 is to remove and reset the curb to obtain that 7-foot parking stall on the south side. I will note, as we just discussed, this includes remove and reset of both curb lines. There could be an opportunity to maybe not touch the northern curb line all that much, and that is a wasp, and save some money there. So that one comes to about $500,000. And then alternative 3, I have highlighted in red here to put in perspective that $600,000 value that we're talking about. Again, that grant only covers probably what we're looking at for that $500,000 value. So that extra $100,000 at the minimum will likely have to come directly from the town's pocket or another grant opportunity. It also has that plus sign because, as you can see in the bottom right here, I have constructability. So we're talking about a moderately more complex project. So the engineering design fee may change slightly. The coordination with the state to change their facility may change slightly. So all of that adds up to most likely more than $600,000, but we're only looking at construction costs in this case. Some of the other things to note here is the color coding kind of depicts, and I see that the pink is a little light, sorry about that, but the color coding kind of depicts some of the other impacts that may be considered with the alternatives. So pedestrian safety, vehicle safety, right-of-way impacts, utility impacts. And again, this is all based off of these conceptual alternatives where we're taking a template of the typical section and trying to quickly see what it may impact along the corridor. So a minor thing may change to moderate, a moderate thing may change to minor once we get into the actual design. But this is our, I don't want to say guess, but our best prediction of what the impacts could be. And then we talk about aesthetics, the permits required. We'll talk about some of the natural resource, historic resources, and archaeological resources a little later because they are talking more so for the entire corridor, not just the western or eastern section. And then satisfying the purpose and need and constructability. Any questions on any of this information?
When we walked it do you remember that one piece of curb on the north side that's way out of alignment right
Yes.
by the storm drain?
Yep.
If we were to do the plan 1 for the north side and plan 2 for the south side, could we do still
Absolutely.
fix that one little, so it doesn't have to be all or nothing.
Absolutely. I think that even if we picked alternative one, we would look to identify those isolated sections that is going to be extremely difficult to put a sidewalk next to because of breakage or misalignment of the curb. So,
Absent curb.
yeah, or no curb, yeah. So we would look to still touch those pieces that were identified in the field walk and that we'll identify further in the next phase. This price does not take that into consideration, but I guess alternative 2 and 3 price does, the alternative 1 price does not. Any other thoughts on this? Questions, comments, concerns? Great. So let's talk about the eastern half. So when looking at this next half of the project, we're only going to talk about 2 alternatives. The needs that we identified for this project are slightly different because they would take an extensive effort to add parking east of Prospect Street. So because of that, we're only talking about essentially replacing the existing sidewalk facility in its more or less current location. So when we talk about alternative 1, we're talking about maintaining that existing curb line and just replacing the sidewalk and doing a safety audit more or less of the crossing facility and doing improvements based off of that safety audit. When we talk about alternative 2, so this is the very end of the project, I'll highlight here before we go to alternative 2, the existing sidewalk ends right here currently, so we would be looking to extend it to the driveway to terminate the project appropriately for ADA and other things that we discussed in the sidewalk. When talking about alternative 2, we talk about replacing that curb line again. So this is, instead of a utility reason of replacing the curb line, we're now talking about an aesthetic reason of replacing the curb line. So we're not really adding any benefit to the usage of the roadway by replacing the curb line in this alternative. It, again, more or less resets it to create a uniform corridor with the sidewalk that's being replaced and make it all look fresh. Looking at prices for alternative 1 and alternative 2 for the eastern half of this project only, we're looking at approximately $270,000 for alternative 1 where we maintain the curb lines and approximately $460,000 for the remove and reset of that southern curb only. We're not talking about anything on the northern side because there's no sidewalk there for this section of the project. As you can see, there's not many difficulties or challenges that were identified with right-of-way and other utility impacts and stuff like that that we would be looking to avoid. There is a larger green belt through this section for the majority of it, and the buildings and dwellings are further offset from the existing curb line, so it makes the project relatively a little bit more easier. Any questions?
So the main difference between 1 and 2 would be aesthetic improvements?
Remove and resetting of the curb or replacement where needed due to breakage. And there's usually approximately 15 to 20% breakage when we're touching curb anyway, so we include 15 to 20% of a breakage factor where new granite curb would have to be installed. So yeah, because the remove and reset of the curb in the western section was for adding a parking area, this eastern section is for not, so it's just for looks essentially.
It seems to me like a lot of money for not a great improvement because there's so much separation between the sidewalk and the curb that it's not like in the section where the curb is right up against the sidewalk and it's like
Correct.
old sloppy curb and brand new lovely sidewalk.
Yeah.
And also, am I right that a lot of the ground is higher than the
Yes.
sort of mounds over it?
Mounds
So it
over.
really doesn't even show that much.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Am I right about that? The
Correct.
curve.
For the most part. There is a small section, the last couple hundred feet or so, where the sidewalk is directly adjacent to the roadway, but ultimately that actually looked more or less like the best section of sidewalk throughout the corridor, so. It's most likely because it's not pitched between the vehicular and plow traffic and the building foundations. There's that larger buffer that is promoting things to move without shoving and heaving happening.
So it makes alternative one seem more attractive to me for the eastern
Absolutely,
section.
absolutely. And I think that's maybe where you make up some money, where we weren't really thinking about parking possibly when we found the original construction. Maybe it gives you some further opportunities. Any other questions, comments, or concerns about the alternative discussion? All right, so I will just quickly mention some of the natural cultural resources that we've been considering. So as I had mentioned, part of our existing conditions review included a review of all the natural resources that may be impacted or within the project limits of consideration. We like to look at least 50 feet outside of our limit of impact to consider when we're looking at wetlands and other natural resources. We also looked at a historical review of the corridor as well as an archaeological review of the corridor. So these are all preliminary results. I don't have the actual reports done yet. That will be all part of our NEPA and permitting piece after conceptual plans. But I want to mention some of the preliminary findings that were outlined to me in emails. So from an archaeological perspective, the eastern third of this project is actually on a terraced landform of the Roaring Brook, so it is potentially an archaeological sensitive area because of that landform. So we think about maybe there was a community a long time ago that lived along this river, and some of those artifacts or items washed down the river, got pushed into the outside of the bend on the river, and then other soil deposits came over it and buried it. So we're thinking about that from an archaeological standpoint. This has been an identified feature that would be of consideration. That being said, the majority of this project corridor is pre-disturbed soil conditions. So likely if anything like that was present, it would have already been found and noted. And we haven't found record of it being found and noted yet. There is still a desktop review that hasn't been concluded. So some of the considerations to maybe mitigate this that we'll take throughout conceptual plan development is maintaining the existing sidewalk alignment where possible to make sure that we're staying within an existingly disturbed area, and then limiting our adventures off that existing alignment, and unless we can prove that that soil has been disturbed through historic photos that have been documented of the Wallingford Center. From a historical resource evaluation perspective, it's noted that this project actually lies within two registered historic centers, so one being a national registry, the other one being a state registry. So not only is the majority of the dwellings, if not all, along this corridor, the actual corridor itself has historic significance. So that makes us have an extra keen eye to some of the walkways that are maybe a brick paver heading into a dwelling. Maybe we should be shifting the sidewalk expansion a little bit in one direction or the other to minimize that. But also from a corridor perspective, it has these nice green belts with some trees and stuff like that, and that brings value to the historic nature of the corridor itself. So all of that is under scrutiny in a corridor like this when we're developing. So we have a careful mind around what our impacts are, what's permittable and what's not, and that's why we have a historian on the project team. From a natural resource perspective, we reviewed the corridor twice now, and both times came up with not really any wetlands or other natural resource features that we have to be of concern within the project limits. The only thing to note with natural resources that we've come up to date with is the consideration of bats if we are going to be removing any trees. And unfortunately, this is still an evolving thing currently in the natural resource realm with different requirements and permits around the clearing and what's permittable, what's not, what's a roost tree. So that's just something that we're going to keep in mind as we're looking at the corridor development. Any questions on that? All right. Without any further questions, I'm going to kind of have some wrap-up slides here. So, talking about next steps, as I had mentioned, the next step is identifying what the preferred alternative is to then take through the design and construction of this project. So to do that, we're looking for all public feedback from all of you and anyone that's watching after this to reach out to us, give us any public feedback you may have by December 1. After that, we're going to have a steering committee meeting and discuss all the public feedback and discuss what our preferred alternative may be. From there, the steering committee is going to take that preferred alternative and the public feedback to a select board meeting on December 18th, and they will confirm or deny, hopefully confirm, what the preferred alternative is, and then we will jump into the further project development of this project. And again, looking to construct hopefully no later than summer of 2026. With any luck, we can possibly push that up a year. That's all I have. I don't know if you have any other questions, comments, or concerns. My contact information and Stephanie's contact information is on screen here. Feel free to reach out to us at any point in time between now and December 1, or even after that, it just may be too late.
Could you put the previous slide back up?
Sure.
No, not that one, the one before that. That one, yeah, thank you.
So Brandon, in the permitting step, you might want to let folks know what the current time frame for getting through the National Environmental Protection Act process looks like, because that really has a strong influence on the amount of time that permitting and right-of-way
Absolutely.
has to take.
So she's talking about NEPA is the other term for that. So essentially, we have identified that we will have to get a NEPA compliance document in, likely in the form of a CE or categorical exclusion. We'll also be looking at Section 1111 permit because we're working within the V-Trans right away. And then I think there's one more that I can't remember off the top of my head. But those the last one I mentioned, the Section 1111 is more so a formality. The NEPA one that Stephanie is referring to has roughly a 6-month minimum duration. So that essentially means they'll take our conceptual plans and we will submit that with the NEPA documentation that identifies those natural and cultural resources that I was talking about, like the final conclusions of them. And submit that to V-Trans, and for them to spit out an approval is usually about 6 months or so. And that usually, pending the project, means that you're not starting final plans until after you have that in hand. Some projects, though, if they have an accelerated track, we're able to start developing final plans before the actual NEPA certification comes in, but we cannot submit them and ever pass the final plan stage. So we're really looking at that 6-month roadblock.
And I would just note that my experience recently with NEPA has been more like 8 months.
8 months, yeah. Yeah, so that 6 months is a minimum.
Yeah, minimum.
Yeah.
Can you, so that would mean that, let's say it took 8 months, what needs to get what would be bumped down? Would you still be doing the right-of-way? Would you still be doing the?
Yeah, so right away and NEPA can happen at the same time.
Okay, but the final plans can't be approved until you get
NEPA
the.
and right away is both clear. So the right away clear could be very expedited, faster than NEPA, if there's no right away impacts.
Right.
It's more of a certification if there's no right away impacts. If there's right away impacts, then that could be a year. It could be more.
Right.
Yeah, I just want folks to understand that once we've developed the conceptual plans and compiled all the documentation for the NEPA review, you're gonna basically kind of pause. You know, we're gonna be in a holding pattern for several months, waiting for the NEPA, clearance as well as the right-of-way approvals to come through. So, you can kind of get like antsy, like, what the heck's going on? But
Yeah.
we expect a holding pattern for several months before we're going to be able to have the clearances to proceed into the final plans.
And then in that process of going, once you've got those permits to the final plans, how much of a process is that?
It's, again, like I mentioned, we can usually start final plans, we just can't submit them, but as I had noted here, it is approximately 2 to 3 months worth of work to develop final plans.
After the permitting process is completed?
Correct.
Because any comments that may come in as a result of the review for NEPA or right-of-way from the Agency of Transportation would have to get incorporated into the final, they would take the conceptual plans and then any feedback that comes in as a result of the permitting and right-of-way review has to get incorporated into the final plans along with a lot more detail and information in the engineering design set.
So I would say even at a very minimum, if we got permission to start developing final plans before NEPA was finalized, there's still at least a month of work after NEPA is finalized because, like the comments were mentioned, the other thing is construction specifications, which is the first time that we develop them for this project is at final plans. That is a process that is always changing with the current construction environment. So it's malpractice to develop construction plans anything more than like 2 or 3 weeks before you actually submit the final plans because the documents are always changing. The requirements with the state government is always changing. Fair wages, Davis-Bacon, all of that is ever evolving. So
I have a question about
Sure.
about the cost. The projections that you give, I presume, are based on estimates of what the cost is going to be at the time you actually are going to undertake the construction. And I realize that's something that's fluctuated quite a bit in the last few years. I guess you can just use your best projections.
yeah, so if you look at historical trends, even though they've gone like this over the last like 2 years, the average over the last 10 years is 5 to 7% per year. So we usually use 5% per year. And then we also tack on, so in this level of an estimate, we're only counting the big items. So we draw a typical section like this, and each of these different shapes, so the green is grass, the yellow beige color is gravel, that's concrete, that's curb. So we'll take those numbers, we'll calculate what 1 linear foot of this is and multiply it by the project. So it's not, and then we take an incidental cost too for like, we counted 5 different drainage structures that we'll likely touch with this concept. Okay, drainage structure, $5,000. And we take ballpark numbers and then we usually multiply anywhere from 15 to 25% onto the end as an incidental fee.
Right, thank you.
So that level of certainty gets a lot clearer once we hit conceptual plans or the preferred alternative because we're actually going at each station to station, saying, okay, there's 24 feet curb here, but then a 20-foot drive open, and then 50 feet curb here, so like we actually itemize it at conceptual plans. Any other questions, comments, or concerns?
So following the presentation, will you make this slideshow available so that it can be posted on the town website? So in addition to having a PEG TV video recording, folks will be able to access these materials online?
Absolutely. I will PDF, I already have a PDF of this actually, so I will share that with the steering committee and the town and publish that on their website. And possibly share with you if desired.
So that way there's some reference materials available during this kind of public review period. With the hope that folks will share with the town what they think they'd like to see by December 1st.
Absolutely. We welcome all feedback.
It's exciting to finally have this moving.
Well, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.